This is Keys to the Shop, episode 452, championing the customer experience in coffee with three-time South African Barista Champion, Winston Douglas Thomas. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show. Always happy to have you along. And if you're interested in exploring lots of the show's past episodes, which we have over 800, lots to choose from, actually, you can subscribe to the show. Just hit subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and then you can search all of our past episodes, specials, Rate of Rise, Shift Break, which are the short format episodes on Thursdays, long form episodes like this today, and more. So you can also find a lot of information over at keystotheshop.com. Included in terms of what you can find on the website over at keystotheshop.com is Keys to the Shop Consulting. Now, this is not just a podcast, Keys to the Shop. It's also a consulting and coaching company that allows me to be able to work directly with you and your team, whether you're just starting off a coffee shop or you are already an existing operator and seen some success in your coffee shop, but you want to explore what it looks like to enter into the next phase of business. There might be some challenges you need help overcoming, or there might be some clarity that you need to render toward decisions that you need to make for scaling, refining your operations, people, and quality. These are the types of things that drive me as a professional, and why we focus on so much of it in the Keys to the Shop podcast. But I also love working one-on-one with my clients to help them build a thriving, profitable, and joy-filled coffee shop that their customers, their staff, and they themselves actually like working in and going to. So if that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. That's CHRIS@keystotheshop.com to inquire about Keys to the Shop Consulting. And we can have a free discovery call, talk all about what you've got going on and how Keys to the Shop Consulting can help you. chris@keystotheshop.com. I want to let you know also that the Keyholder coaching groups are coming up shortly. The March cohort, we're going to launch multiple groups. We have the initial group that started in September. It has been going so well, and I am really hopeful that you get to experience what it's like to be in community with other coffee shop owners who are dedicated to each other's success, who invest into insights and accountability and vulnerability and walking alongside one another in this journey of ownership. That's what the Keyholder coaching groups are all about. If you're interested, email chris@keystotheshop.com. I will have a conversation with you, and I'll send you an early application before it opens to the public for these coming groups up in March for Keyholder coaching groups. Let's have a conversation. chris@keystotheshop.com. So I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Ground Control. Ground Control has been changing the game for batch brew coffee for quite a while in specialty coffee. Their SCA award-winning technology gives you access to an incredible range of flavors and extraction potential in all of your coffee, making it much easier to surprise and delight your guests in coffee. Their new brewer is smaller, more compact, but it boasts a 30% higher volume of batch espresso and batch cold brew concentrate. And it's cloud connected to a smart dispenser that tracks all of your brewing data. And people use this not only for batch brew, but also, like I mentioned, concentrates for iced lattes and also 8-minute cold brew. This opens up lots of avenues for revenue in your business, and it looks beautiful doing it. So go to groundcontrol.coffee, learn more about this amazing piece of equipment and what it can do for your coffee shop. I highly recommend them. Again, groundcontrol.coffee. I also want to let you know about the Barista Series. The Barista Series it feels funny to say, let you know about, because it feels like you must know about the Barista Series. It's a line of plant-based beverages that is designed for baristas by Pacific, that is also tested by some amazing baristas all over the world before any of their lineup even makes it to market. That's why it's a performance beverage. It stands up to the heat from steaming, produces amazing texture for latte art, and it also keeps the balance focused on the coffee. I'm talking about the taste balance. So whether you're getting something that's almond or soy or oat or whatever it is that you choose, you can have full confidence that they have put an incredible amount of research, energy, and heart into this, big supporters of the coffee industry. And I would encourage you to go to pacificfoodservice.com, get samples, and try it for yourself. If you're looking for the best plant-based milk for your business, for your cafe, to serve your customers, I think you need to be looking at the Barista series from Pacific. Okay, everyone. Well, I love these conversations where we get to not only explore the arc of somebody's career, but glean a lot of wisdom from what they have learned in that career. And today we continue that tradition of talking to really inspiring people and learning from what they've learned and how they have taught and just how they've matured in the industry. And it's going to teach us a lot about what we can do in our cafes and our own journey in coffee to really move coffee forward, but also find fulfillment in how we serve people as we pursue coffee. We're talking with Winston Douglas Thomas. Winston Thomas grew up in the small suburb of Strand in Cape Town, studied civil engineering at CPUT, and developed an interest in coffee after reading a letter to his local newspaper of somebody complaining there was no good coffee in his area. And so that sparked his interest in coffee and the exploration of coffee. And during his studies, he completed a barista course. And after getting his diploma from university, he decided to work in coffee full time. And since then, he has managed to win the South African Aeropress Championship in 2016, the West Cape Barista Championship for 2017, 2018, and 2020, and the South African Barista Championship 2017, 18, and 2020, as well as the African Barista Championship title for 2019. He now owns and runs a coffee training and consulting business called Winston Douglas Coffee and a coffee roastery called Cedar Coffee Roasters. So Winston's evolution as a barista, while starting actually as a consumer, then barista, then competitor, and now business owner, trainer, consultant, and owner of a roastery, obviously opens us up to discover a lot of great insights that he has learned along that path. And that's exactly where we go with our conversation today. Not only is it an exploration of his journey, but also we're going to talk a lot about the comparisons between what we do in our own world of specialty coffee and in competition versus what is relevant, meaningful, and impactful to regular customers and the world of coffee bars that we all operate in. I find a lot of what Winston has shared and how he has come to view himself and kind of find himself as a professional and the way he approaches training people today is going to really impact how you view what you do, I think, because it's somebody who has toured various levels of coffee that are available to us and come away with this idea of how relationships and people, hospitality and service are paramount. And we dive deep into a lot of these questions and topics, including how we market our businesses, how we perceive ourselves in the industry, and what customers are looking for from us that will help us serve them well. So what a pleasure it is to get to talk to Winston. Let's get right to it. Here now is our interview with Winston Douglas Thomas. All right, Winston, how are you today?
I'm very good, thanks, Chris. Beautiful sunny day in Cape Town. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And I have been obviously well aware of your career, very decorated competitor and coffee professional, seeing you on Barista Magazine and the articles about your career and how you've been developing as a professional and helping others develop as a professional, obviously through training and consultation. So today, I really am excited to dive into your story a little bit and learn from somebody who has learned so much and also is helping other people learn a lot. So I'd like to learn a little bit first about what inspired your beginning in specialty coffee such that it turned into a career for you, which is kind of a common story in specialty. We all just kind of like maybe happen into it. I don't think you went to a job fair and signed up at the table for specialty coffee. So how did you get into this space and what really kept you in it?
I started officially in coffee in 2014, but in 2012, I was studying civil engineering. The town that I'm from is about 40 kilometers outside of the city center, so it's quite a small town. And we had a little local newspaper, and a woman had written a letter to the newspaper complaining that there was no good coffee in our town. She had just moved from Johannesburg down to Cape Town. And she said she had to drive to the city or to a nearby town called Stellenbosch to get decent coffee. And at the time, I was a big fan of chocolate mochas with 3 sugars because I've got quite a sweet tooth. And I couldn't understand why she was complaining about bad coffee and took the time to write a letter to complain, because that's where your complaints had to go to back then. And so I Googled best coffee in Cape Town, and all these coffee shops and roasteries in the city had popped up. And I made a little list. And part of my studies was working during vacations and holidays. And when I did that, the office or the company that I worked for, I worked in the contracts and tender documents department. So often when a proposal was put in to work on a new job, it had to be dropped off at the civic center in the city. And so whenever I went into the CBD to drop off a document, I'd go to one of these coffee shops and order coffee. I had a little notebook, so I'd write down my experience. And I just tried to understand what makes coffee good, what separates a good cup from a bad cup. And I had some interesting experiences. I thought I was starting to understand this coffee thing. And whenever I ordered an Americano, I'd get the option of hot milk or cold milk. And I finally decided to order something new. So I walked into one cafe and I ordered a cappuccino. And thinking that I knew something about coffee, I said, make that with cold milk. And this was a time when iced coffees wasn't a thing. And the woman at the counter looked at me. And at this point, which I can relate to customers now, I didn't want to seem like I don't know what I'm talking about. So she asked me, are you sure? And I was like, cold milk. And they gave me this lukewarm, disgusting cappuccino. I had 2 sips and I threw it away. And that was a good lesson very early on. And so it became very interesting. Like, why do I get this cold milk, hot milk thing with Americano? What's the difference? And basically fell headfirst into this thing. And I think it became quite serious a year later when I enrolled into a barista course. In my June, July sort of university vacation, I guess I was at a point in my life where I wanted to try a lot of new things. So at the same time, I had picked up a guitar and tried to learn how to play the guitar. I had started surfing and I got into this coffee thing. And I was like, cool, if I want to learn, like, let's go and do a course. So I enrolled into a 3-day barista course. And after finishing the course, I was like, yeah, I think this is what I want to do. I think I was also questioning engineering and what my life would look like working in construction and engineering at that point, because my dad and my brother had been in the industry for a long time. I think I was just in a growth phase in my life where I wanted to take a risk and do something that I enjoyed, irrespective of what I'd get paid, instead of following a career where in a couple of years I'd get a decent salary and I could buy the house and the white picket fence and all those things. And so that was 2013. And a year later, after I graduated with a diploma, so I was a year short of getting a degree, I was the first person in my house to actually go to university and study. So I said to my folks, like, here's the diploma. I actually want to work in coffee. And at the beginning, I think they thought it would be just a phase I'd go through. And so first week of August 2014, I'd been working part-time at a few markets and cafes before I started working full-time. But August 2014, I started training at Origin Coffee Roasting, which is the same place where I did my barista course. And that's where it all started, I guess, just an interest in coffee and trying to understand, like, what is quality, which I guess to this day, you still ask yourself the question, but just started with a healthy curiosity. And yeah, that was 10 years ago on this year.
Yeah, congrats, 10 years. Wow. That is the anniversary this year. So that's pretty cool. And I'm struck by your desire to learn more, even when it wasn't your career. And it must be something that you have just as a person, like built in the curiosity and desire to organize your thoughts and explore, maybe an engineer's mind to keep a list of all the coffees and track notes and things. I mean, there are professionals that just don't do that when they go drink coffee. And as a consumer, you were fascinated enough to actually make a study of it, which I'm sure was helpful. Is that something that you feel is just kind of built into you when it comes to maybe not just coffee? Maybe you did that with surfing and also with the guitar and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think by nature, you can ask my wife. I'm always quite curious, and I to a certain extent, I like to understand how things work. I really enjoyed engaging with different people. So I think part of the experience sitting down and making notes was making notes about the coffee, what I thought about it, even though I had no clue. but also writing my experience and engagement with the baristas and the staff. Like, I took a friend to a coffee shop once and we ordered coffee, and I just started drinking flat whites. So I was taking it to the next level now. And the barista said I had moved down from 3 sugars to 1 sugar, but the barista said not to add any sugars and taste the coffee before you add the sugar. This is what we do to the milk. This is why it will taste sweeter. And it was interesting because the coffee did taste really good without sugar and the milk was perfectly textured. But what struck me was the fact that the barista came to talk to me about the coffee. Like, he brought the coffee out to my table. He spoke to me about the coffee. He told me this thing, and what he said was true. He wasn't just trying to sell this thing to me. He was actually being helpful and insightful. And so, as much as like my recording of my experiences was about the coffee itself, I think it was also about the people factor of it. And I think that's a big part of why I'm still in coffee today. That's how it all started, I guess. It was reading a newspaper. It wasn't tasting that magical cup. A lot of people talk about that, that magical espresso that just converted them to be a coffee drinker. Mine was reading about an experience in a letter in a newspaper. And that's what got me excited and curious about it.
Yeah, your go-to coffee moment is that lukewarm cappuccino with the cold milk.
Come on, Chris. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Oh man. Well, I'll tell you, it really is interesting to hear about the holistic kind of perspective of the experience, the standout of a barista actually talking to you. As a mocha with sugar drinker, a lot of places would dismiss customers similar. Maybe not so much today. I feel like we're swinging back toward a wider, more accepting way of approaching customers, which is nice. But at the time in coffee, it wasn't necessarily the case. With the time you're talking about, I feel like we were at peak pretension in a lot of ways. Maybe I don't know how it was in South Africa at the time, because a lot of the third wave that I experienced here in the States in the mid aughts translated to a lot of pretension. But when this hospitality experience you had happened to you, yeah, obviously it stood out. And I'm curious, when it comes to your development as a professional, you've got this beginner's mind, you've got this idea of, I want to explore coffee more, but you were also working part time while you were exploring coffee. So, how did you develop yourself as a craftsperson with coffee, your own kind of understanding of it, but also take that experience of hospitality that you received and integrate that into how you were at the markets and on the bar?
It was quite a challenge back then because I had a lot of sort of conflicting experiences in coffee because there was A, what I had learned in the barista course, B, so the market that I worked in, it was a guy that I had met at a shopping mall, and he said, if you come and work for me for free, I will teach you how to make coffee.
Okay.
Which at the time to me was like, great, there's a guy that wants to hire me. Like, I don't need to get paid. I just want to learn how to make coffee. So I showed up at this market and he eventually gave me the tips and started paying me eventually. But the first few shifts were kind of like just me wanting to make coffee. And that was a really exciting thing. But the way he had made coffee, which was cappuccino, thick froth with a spoon dotted on, what he displayed the coffee to be, which was a blend of 3 different coffees versus what it said on the bags, was different. And I was questioned. Actually, today, a very good friend of mine, he was the best man at my wedding. He came to have coffee. We didn't know one another at the time. And he questioned, like, what you're displaying here and what's on the bag is different. Like, why is there a difference? What are you actually serving? I couldn't answer the question because I was that new in coffee. And then the cafe that I worked in part time, between the barista course, the market, and the cafe I worked in, it was very conflicting opinions on how to make coffee, how to serve coffee, how to handle guests. So it was a very confusing time for me. So I can't say I knew what I was doing at the time because I was just being confused. But to be behind the espresso machine was such an exciting thing. To me, it was just getting enough time to make coffee and trying to finish off my studies as soon as I can so I could dive headfirst. I think it planted a seed to a certain extent, and we might touch on this a little bit later, but sort of the conflicting ideas and opinions on coffee, on how it needs to be made, what is real quality, and how to engage with customers. It kind of stuck with me, that confusing period. And later on, it's really something that I wanted to get to the bottom of and build a more solid foundation as to how I make coffee, what I believe quality to be, and how I engage with customers. Because before I started working full time, things were just all over the place.
Oh man, I can experience this anew, but just by thinking back to the early years of trying to find what do I do, where do I stand, what do I think, and everybody is an authority because you don't know anything. So anyone who knows something automatically is an expert. And I joke with people like that's what family does. When they find out you're into coffee, they're automatically like, well, we have a coffee expert in the family. And I'm like, oh, no, not necessarily. But and so there's a lot of confusion, obviously, that is eventually you land on a way to do things. And when you talk about diving headfirst into everything, learning enough to sort of make this your singular focus, when was the singularity for you? When did this happen? That you became confident enough that this is kind of the way that I think things should be. I want to pursue this. I feel comfortable and not as awkward as I used to be in the industry. What was that moment, and why do you think that moment was definitive for you?
Believe it or not, it came much later on working in coffee. I'd love to say that it came after the first year or two, but I feel like it only came 2018, 2019. It's after about 4 or 5 years of working in coffee, simply because when I started in August 2014, I started working at Origin Coffee Roasting here in Cape Town, which is one of the most well known coffee roasteries in the country, multiple barista champions coming from Origin. And it was an amazing place to learn about coffee. But after I'd left Origin at the end of 2017, having won a South African Championships, Barista Championships, having been at the WBC, after I left Origin, I got to experience a side of coffee that I wasn't exposed to as a very privileged barista at Origin. And when I started Winston Douglas Coffee, which was consulting and SCA training and things like that, only then, I got put in a lot of coffee environments that I hadn't been in before. For example, a hotel that had two different grinders. One was a specialty coffee blend, and the other was an imported dark roasted European blend because during season, the hotel had a certain group of European clientele that would come there every year, and that's the coffee they wanted to drink. And so for the first time, I needed to dial in the grinder with a very dark roasted imported coffee, which I'd never gotten to do before. I was also a barista trainer at Origin. And when I had left and started experimenting and diving into SCA training and eventually becoming an AST trainer, I started to form my own opinions on coffee, not based on the establishment in which I worked or the specific content given to me by the SCA, but I could take what the SCA needed me to teach, my experiences, and put it together to teach it in a certain way comfortably. And if students questioned me, I had answers because that was coming from obviously what is fact, because the SCA gives us content which is factual, but also the way I understand it and all my experiences. And so it's a bit weird because only at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, did I really feel like, I feel comfortable in who Winston is in coffee, what I understand, what I believe in, what I stand for. I guess my sense of individuality sort of came out during that time. I think there was a lot of imposter syndrome as well because the two WBCs I won, or not WBCs, excuse me, South African Barista Championships, they were quite close to one another. It was 2017 and 2018. And so there was a lot happening. And I think only at the end of 2018 did I really come down from this high of winning competitions, traveling quite a bit, leaving a place I'd worked at for 4 years, starting my own business, traveling around the country, doing so many things, and then having a chance to breathe and reflect. And I think that's when I started feeling comfortable about like who Winston is and what Winston believes in coffee today.
So when you were at Origin, and then I imagine that was the start of your competition career, and you win these competition, like you mentioned, it's a high, but it sounds like it clouded your perspective in some ways. Not that it's a detriment, but in some ways maybe. But you needed to get some distance from the experience of competition to get clarity on how to move forward in your career. And so I'm kind of curious about this because when you look at competitors in these competitions, there's a lot of confidence. I know it's scripted, it's a performance. And so when you then say, well, on the back end of things, I'm still trying to find out who I am in the industry. I'm curious what about the competitions helped you in that journey to develop yourself professionally and the identity that you kind of have now as a professional, and what may have not been so helpful in the midst of all of the success of the competition?
So I think even before I had won a competition, there were a lot of small things that were very helpful. For example, working on bar as a barista for a year and a half, you get relatively comfortable with frothing milk, pulling shots and engaging with people. But only after I returned from the barista competition, was I able to confidently do things such as froth milk, engage with someone in front of me, pour their coffees while still engaging with them, engaging with a sort of a large crowd of people. So Origin had their bar split between espresso and filter. And on the filter side, which we call the brew bar, we had different brewing methods and different coffees. So we had Aeropress, French press, pour overs, and things like that, and multiple coffees to choose from. So often a crowd would gather around the bar. After I had competed at barista competitions, coming back into the bar, I was suddenly able to engage with a group of 4 to 8 people on the bar, keep everybody engaged, make coffee at the same time, and offer a very sort of solid and meaningful service to clients in the cafe. And so those are quite simple returns that I realized I may not have picked up as quickly had I not gone to barista competitions. And things like just experimenting with coffees. I think working in a very busy cafe, you pick up skills such as multitasking, frothing milk consistently, splitting your milk, dialing in the mornings, but you're limited to the coffee that you're serving for the day, depending on where you work. But with the barista competition, you're sort of forced to take one coffee and pull it apart when it comes to extractions, trying to link processing to what you're tasting, signature beverage, and all of these things. And so I think from a coffee perspective, it really elevated my learning because it was sort of concentrated learning. So I'd stay after work in the evenings and just like pull multiple espresso shots. And it got to a point where I was also understanding what I was tasting. So in the beginning, I had no clue what I was tasting. And I was almost afraid to share the flavor notes because in my head, they seemed ridiculous. And I remember taking espresso shots up to our 2 roasters, who were the 2 most experienced guys in the space, and taking it to them and say, cool, do you get this? This is what I get. And I got a lot of no's before I started getting yeses. But once they started agreeing with what I was tasting, it gave me a lot more confidence to articulate what I was getting. And then going to the barista competitions, of course, to a certain extent, you get validated. Your flavor notes get validated by judges and by other competitors. And so, like, I think the scale started falling off my eyes when it came to tasting coffees and stuff like that, and just being confident in describing what I'm tasting. So those were immediate returns that I got from just competing from baristas, apart from winning. But winning the competitions and going to worlds obviously comes with a lot of benefit, which is sort of career development, marketing opportunities, and stuff like that. But I think because it becomes more of a challenge as you go from a regional competition to a national competition and a WBC, all of a sudden you have to have a deeper understanding of a coffee. You have to understand how to articulate the coffee better. And in the beginning, it was quite a challenging thing. When I won in 2017, I think it was a bit too, I won the competition and so I qualified for WBC, but I had no idea what I needed to say for my speech on stage. I had no idea which coffee to choose. And so, although I was the South African Barista Champion, I think I went in thinking that I'm the underdog. I've only been in coffee for 2 years and African competitors never made it through to the next round. And I think I carried that with me for a year or two, just like going into the competitions with just a low confidence. And I remember Maxwell actually coached me in 2017. And I learned so much from the man in my experiences. I flew to Bath and I spent a couple of days with him. But I was so nervous because I was sitting with Maxwell Kalana Dashwood in his cafe. And I think it made me even more nervous because there was pressure that Maxwell's coaching me and what do I say? What's going to sound right? What's not going to sound right? This is going to be on TV, on YouTube. And actually, I swore twice on stage in WBC by accident, of course, because I generally don't swear. But under my breath, like if you watch the video, you can hear me cursing twice.
I'm totally going to go back and take a look.
If you can find it, Chris, I'm not sure if it's still there, but my uncle messaged me after the competition. He lives in New Zealand. He's like, hey, I watched this competition thing and it's cool. It's interesting, but you're probably not allowed to swear, right? And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, just go back and watch your video. And I watched it. And if you listen closely enough, because the mics were so sensitive, like I made 2 errors and just like under my breath, it just came out. It's still quite embarrassing to think of. So there was all this expectation. As much as I went in there as a South African Barista Champion, I didn't have a lot of confidence. I wasn't sure if the coffees were the right coffees, if what I was tasting was in fact there or not. That was quite a challenge going into the competitions. And I think I took that on in my first 2 competitions, 2017 and 2018. I tried to build up my confidence, but I think I went into it thinking like, is this good enough? what are people going to think about your set? Does what you say have any meaning? Is your coffee good enough? And there's certain factors that came up when I won South Africa for the first time. I won't mention the name, but I emailed quite a reputable coffee producer, which had supplied coffees to many different competitors. And that was one of the first places to start. And they declined my request for green samples because they only supplied competitors from certain countries. And so immediately off the bat, I was like, okay, so like I'm not going to get access to certain coffees because I'm from South Africa. What does that mean? And I think those kind of things kind of played in my mind leading up into the competition. I'm very happy that I ended up using Geisha Village. If that hadn't happened, I probably wouldn't have ended up with Geisha Village, which led to so many amazing memories and opportunities. But I can say, for me, at least in my personal experience, that was a part of the barista competition, which was conflicting because it helped me learn a lot. I built a lot of amazing relationships through those first two WBCs, and I yielded a lot of returns from it. But at the same time, sort of my confidence and identity was questioned quite a bit in those first 2 years. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Chris.
No, it does. And I'm really interested in this idea of, when you're talking about does what I say have meaning? And you're talking to a group of volunteer judges that represent a large scale amalgamation of coffee from around the world versus the people that you were serving at a market and the mocha customers that you served as a barista. It's such an interesting contrast to have the fine tunes and the stress of is what I say meaningful, yet you translate that to somebody who is at your bar, whether it was at origin or at market, it's going to be. And as you exit the competition and out of that ecosystem, how do you recover a sense of normalcy that allows you to be meaningful to, I'll say this with air quotes, real people, these people you're training at your school, and the people that are using your coffee at Cedar Coffee? They're not serving WBC judges or Barista Championship judges. So, taking what you learned about yourself and the way you're thinking about becoming relevant with your speech and the quality, what does it look like to then go and apply these things in an environment that's not as stringent to truly be meaningful and impactful in that ecosystem?
I think it starts with taking WBC off the pedestal that I put it on. And I think as a young barista, you watch WBCs or Brewers Cup and all these things. And these are people that you look up to and you can learn a lot from them. And I think I went into the competitions with the WBC on quite a high pedestal. And after 2018, deciding to take a year off from competition in 2019, I started my training and consulting company. And so it put me in a lot of interesting cafe spaces. So one of the things I did one year was I did a sort of a cafe tour, which was 5 different cafes in 5 days along what we call the garden route in Cape Town. So it's up along the coast. And it was 5 very different cafes in 5 very different spaces. That was one of the first things I did after WBC 2018. And it was very different to Origin because it's not Cape Town in South Africa. Excuse me for all the South Africans that listen to this and don't agree with what I'm saying, but Cape Town is considered to a certain extent the capital of coffee in South Africa. And when you move out of the CBD, the further you go, coffee changes quite a little bit, as it does when you move out of bigger cities. And so it was cafes that, to me, showed me the value of the coffee beyond things like cup score and prestige, and serving customers that know a lot less about coffee. Because working at Origin, customers walk in with an expectation that they're getting this coffee experience because it's Origin, right? So the type of customers that typically come through the door are very different to customers from my hometown in Strand back home walking through the door. They just want a simple cup of coffee. They want to add their 3 sugars to the chocolate mocha. How can you still provide a meaningful experience to someone walking in, ordering a mocha with 3 sugars? And I think that little garden route trip that I did, it was a sober reminder that, like coffee is bigger than the WBC and these competitions. Like it's a much bigger thing. And I can't compare what I see on social media, what I see on the WB stage to the reality of the coffee experience in South Africa. Fortunately for me, through my consulting experiences and my training, I did quite a lot of work moving around South Africa at the time, doing like different either SEA training or consulting for like a hotel group and things like that. And even we did a little barista boot camp in Rwanda in 2019. And those experiences, like I said, very sobering. And I think that's where my identity started to shape, my confidence starting to come back. And I started to see a deeper meaning to coffee beyond these competitions.
I am fascinated by how the first thing that you did to really decompress and reacclimate to the world of cafes and coffee was to do the thing that you did when you weren't even in coffee, but were a consumer, that you went and toured coffee shops. It seems like that's who you are. And that's like returning back to your roots where you were just going to I'm going to go on a coffee shop tour. I'm going to take some notes. I'm going to experience this. But now you're a champion and now you're experienced, but still those tours and experiencing the cafe itself had so much meaning for you even after all that experience. I think that's wonderful.
So the tour itself was me actually working as a barista on bar within the specific cafes. So as a tour, not as a customer going to a coffee shop and visiting for an hour, but was working as a barista there for the day, which was actually very similar. It was a similar experience, except instead of being in front of the bar, I was behind the bar making coffee, but also just getting to engage with the baristas and the customers at the same time. Because in some cafes, they knew, okay, is the special barista coming for the day. Other customers just walked in and said, hey, can I get a coffee? And I just served them. I wasn't there to announce, Winston is here. And so, do you know who's serving you today? I was just there to serve people coffee. And so it was one and the same for me. Yeah, amazing experience.
Even better. Yeah, you are the customer and now you're the professional, and yet you keep that humility. It reminds me of those videos, something on YouTube where a famous violin player plays free concert in a subway and no one listens.
Yeah, I've seen those.
It's like one person who goes to the orchestra says, "Oh my gosh, do you know who that is?" So let's talk about the idea of training and applying your knowledge along with hospitality. So there's coffee, craft coffee, and then there's hospitality and how we treat people while we're treating them to coffee. So you come across a wide variety of people that come through your trainings. And now for the last 2 years with Cedar Coffee, people using your coffee in their cafe environments. How do you find it best to communicate with people and train people to have a holistic view of hospitality that's not so necessarily obsessive or singularly obsessive with coffee, so that it's actually something that helps us advance our industry in the direction of service and evolving to a higher and more meaningful expression of coffee?
I wish I could say we had a fixed program to teach hospitality, but one of the things I do front and center when it comes to training is to remind students or clients, whoever it might be, that as much as coffee is this craft with all of these variables and it's interesting and there's so much to explore and unpack, at the end of the day, what we're essentially doing is serving someone a coffee. We're not bringing someone behind bar and showing them the variables and telling them about the recipe and talking to them about extraction. And then they pay for the cup and you give it to them. The fundamental thing that we're doing is serving someone coffee. So we need to remember that we're in hospitality. It's a challenge because with some clients, the baristas aren't front facing. So they don't get the opportunity to be hospitable or even engage with clients. But I try and keep that front and center. It's that we're making coffee in hospitality. It's not the other way around. And so to me, the best way to do that is to get people excited about coffee, because a lot of feedback I get from customers, even today. So it's amazing at Cedar, I have some customers from 2014 that are now Cedar clients. The memories they share and when they come to our pop-ups and things like that, it's like, you got me into coffee because you were so excited about it. You took the time to speak to me. And post-winning barista competitions and stuff like that, I get a lot of feedback by people saying like, you know what, you won 2 barista competitions. When you served me coffee, I didn't know you were this barista champion, but you were so patient with me when you spoke to me about coffee, and you didn't mind that I added sugar to my coffee. I have an old client who's also a friend now who used to order quad shot mocha, 2 double shots in a large cup, mocha, and we'd make it like clockwork, no questions asked. And when he needed somebody for a project he was working on related to coffee, he came to me immediately and said, you know what? You were the one guy that made my coffee with no questions asked, took the time to speak to me, and you engaged with me beyond the simple, hey, how are you doing? How's your day? So I remember things about them. And I'd engage on a deeper level because I'd see him every single day, in addition to making his coffee to the best I could. I also wanted to genuinely find out how he's doing and ask him how work's going and what he does for work, which ended up being very interesting. And that's the project we collaborated on a few years later. So I think fundamentally, I tried to get people genuinely excited and passionate about the product and remind them that they need to serve it with as much passion in which they prepared it.
You are hitting on something that people have this fear. There's a fear like you were the person that didn't judge me for my mocha, and that was a deciding factor when we're talking about marketing our businesses to other people. I know we source the best coffee, we have champions working for us. Go down the bullet point list of things, and usually the thing that you don't see in marketing is we're not going to judge you, or we're not pretentious. Yet it seems like a real defining factor that people can't articulate, but it really feels meaningful that somebody is, I'm reticent to go into a coffee shop because I don't want them to stare at me and I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to order a cappuccino with cold milk. It's something like that. Sorry, Winston. Uh, but that's the whole issue is all of the education that you have and other people have cannot compete with the universal need for caring, right?
100%. That's the thing, Chris. I'm the guy that started with a chocolate mocha and 3 sugars. I'm the guy that ordered a cappuccino and asked for cold milk. And so I remind myself as often as I can that like the person I'm serving right now might be in the exact same position. Part of why in the beginning coffee shops were quite intimidating was because you walk into a cafe and there's this long menu and what do? I remember, I'm sure my family won't mind me sharing the story because I've shared it before. But the first time my family came to visit when I was working in a coffee shop, they sat down, they ordered, and I saw the order come in and it was 3 espressos. I was like, 3 espressos? You guys don't drink espressos? So I changed the order and I said, make it flat whites, made the coffee, it went out, and eventually I got a chance to chat to them. And I said, guys, since when do you drink espresso? And they said, like, well, the menu is so long, they've never seen a coffee menu this long. They just took the cheapest thing on the menu. And so that's a very common experience. And so at Cedar, it's not an official sort of Cedar statement, but what I like to say is we want more people to drink better coffee. And there's the temptation of Cedar sourcing the most expensive coffees and all the well-branded coffee producers that you find. And on every second post talking about like Winston, the 3-time barista champion, there's the temptation of doing that, but that's not who we are as a coffee roastery. We just want more people to drink better coffee. And we've had some people who just stumbled upon us through a friend and said, hey, my friend said I should come to you. I drink instant coffee, but I mean, I'm trying to get into this coffee thing. So what can you do for me? And we might ask them, cool, how do you make your coffee at home? I've got a French press. Okay, do you have a grinder? No, I don't have a grinder. It's like, you know what? We'll pre-grind for you. It's not the best thing for your coffee. We'll do it for you. And then the same customer 2 months later buys a grinder, and then they buy a scale. And then 6 months later, they're asking us, when's your next special release coming out? So we've seen people walk through that. I've seen it as a barista serving customers, and we see it now at Cedar. We don't want to exclude anything because my business partner, Lee, before he got into coffee, he wanted to open up a coffee shop and call it 3 sugars. Because at the time, he loved 3 sugars in his coffee. And so we always remind ourselves who we were from a coffee perspective before we started working in coffee, because any customer that walks through our door could be in the same boat.
I like that name, 3 sugars. That's pretty funny. Going from the day when there were cafes that didn't serve any sugar because they didn't think you should have it. So the idea of you having the temptation to use your fame as the on-ramp to gain people's business and notoriety for your cafe. And I'm just thinking about the production of brands in coffee, the flash, the titles, the certifications, all of these things that we use as means to communicate quality or that you can trust us and things like that. It almost feels like if you did do that, how would you know that your business is a solid business and not just something that is using Winston's a champion? I'm going to use this coffee. I'm not a barista champion. I've competed in the past, but from your perspective, do you ever think about that where it's like, is this successful because of who I am or because of what it is?
I do. And I think as a business owner, it would be silly for me not to use that for a certain extent. I think not to play down my achievements, which I worked very hard for, but that can't be the sole focus of what drives our business, because the fame and the fortune is quite fleeting. Next year, there's a new barista champion. You release a special release coffee, 92 scoring cup from a very famous producer. Next month, there's another roastery launching an equally, expensive and interesting coffee. We want to have deep roots as a coffee roastery. And I think in the inception of the roastery and the idea of the roastery, we knew that we should leverage our hard work and our network in the industry and our achievements, but the business can't solely be focused on that. And we're in a healthy space when it comes to that idea now, because if I think back about our partners and the cafes that we work with, it's hard to think of a partner that came on board simply because they heard that Winston was a barista champion, or Lee, my business partner, used to work at a very well-known roastery, which won Coffee Roastery of the Year 2 years in a row in South Africa. And so quite often people only find out that I'm a barista champion if they don't come to our space and see the trophies 2 meetings down the line. But it's the experience they get from us when we talk about coffee. I think in the beginning, the challenge was not giving people too much information before they've committed to using our coffee. And I think that was just inexperience and a bit of ignorance from our part. But in the customers that did end up going with our coffee, they were like, you know what, you guys are so helpful. And you're a barista champion, so that's cool. But that's not the primary reason why people choose to use our coffee or work with us. So it's definitely something we have to keep reminding ourselves about. And even when it comes to Cedar winning certain awards or being in magazines or anything like that, the fame and the fortune is quite fleeting. There needs to be deeper meaning and deeper value that you give to your clients beyond the headline sticker on the bag. It's like roasted by a barista champion.
And people are like, well, we'll see. So maybe we're inflating the meaning of what we do, and the customer is still just trying to figure out what end is up. It reminds me of Klaus Thompson of Coffee Collective was on the show talking about when they started. Between them, they had so much clout in the industry. Yet when they started their roasting company, it seemed like they were just completely invisible and nobody cared. And yeah, we would look at that and be like, are they crazy? Don't they realize who started this company? So I'm very encouraged to hear the kind of level-headed approach to paraphrasing what you said. Like in our ignorance, we gave too much information up front, maybe in the beginning, or that was maybe an expression of insecurity, that we just want to like front load people with so much. It seems like that's maybe our way of validating ourselves in being a little bit too desperate for people's business.
Yeah. As a startup business, myself and Lee, and we've got a third partner, Jean, as well, who's not as active day to day as we are. We were the coffee professionals, but we weren't the businessmen. Even though we had worked for respective roasteries before, it's a lot more personal when you're selling a product where you actually own the business and you're part of the product from the raw materials all the way to the packaged bag of coffee. And there was definitely insecurity in the beginning. We're not salesmen. We're really bad salesmen. We're often too honest. We can often play down our credentials and how much we can do for customers. But I think we've got a more comfortable balance now, 2 years later. But in the beginning, it was definitely a challenge when it came to sitting down, having conversations with potential clients and partners and getting them on board without overloading them with information.
Yeah. Not to be too trite here, but there is that well worn phrase about people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. If I'm passionate about coffee, that's great, but I really want people to care about me first. And then the coffee is cherry on top, I suppose. I'm wanting to know your perspective on just where we are broadly as an industry related to cafes and retail expressions of coffee. You supply people with coffee in this manner. You've got so much experience seeing it around the world and in South Africa. And there's a lot of bifurcation happening in coffee. There's the super automatics that, create a lot more of a streamlined, quick grab and go style coffee. There's high end, super luxury, super exclusive, normal cafes. What do you find as a development in retail coffee most hopeful and exciting in the coming years that you've seen sort of take place and evolve? Where are you really thinking this is really cool? I want to see more of this in specialty retail.
It's a challenging question to a certain extent, because what I experience in South Africa versus what I've seen and experienced on my travels, what I hear in podcasts, and what I see online, it's quite different and often quite contextual based on where you are. So I think the first point is what excites me. I'm not a very geeky coffee guy. So, I mean, latest developments in espresso machines and things like that don't really excite me that much. To me, it's more just the customer, the customer experience, customer engagement, and brewing an amazing coffee and sharing that with someone. So, cafes that are trying to place a lot more emphasis on customer experience and hospitality, that's the kind of thing that excites me. I might get this wrong, but is it omakase,
Yeah, it's sort of a Japanese style of service. I think Blue Bottle just did something.
right? I've seen a lot of that pop up recently. It reminds me of inviting customers to experience a WBC set, for example. So before my most recent competition in Melbourne, I invited some people to come and sit in on my set. And of course, the experience is limited because you delivering all of this information and they can only engage afterwards. But it's a much more intimate, hospitable experience when you're sitting down with someone and serving three people coffee, which realistically isn't your typical cafe setting. But those kind of things make me think that hospitality is becoming the focus of coffee and service is becoming the focus of coffee. It's another conversation for another day, but as much as the idea of super automation providing more experience and time for hospitality, I think brewing the coffee and having control over the variables is part of that hospitality experience because you get to share how you made the coffee. You get to engage with the customer on a deeper level because it's something you made with your hands. That's to me the beauty of coffee. I'm also quite old school. So, I mean, you can give me a semi automatic machine and a dosing chamber grinder. I'm happy to brew a cup of coffee on anything, really. So that's something that excites me quite a bit is the emphasis and the focus on hospitality and service and just creating more room to engage because we're living in a world where things need to be quick, you know. So I think the idea of slowing down and talking about coffee, just engaging with customers, even if they're not interested in the coffee itself, there's still a lot of opportunity to be hospitable and engage, even if the customer isn't interested on the group head temperature or whether you sprayed your coffee beans before you ground it. But at the same time, I think from a South African perspective, there's the temptation of following what you see online. So that can, in terms of the design of your cafe, the coffees that you serve on bar, the equipment that you have, it's very easy to follow what you see abroad. And in certain cases, rightly so, to look up to cafes that you love and do things in a similar way. But since starting Cedar, what I've really started to ask myself is what does an authentic South African coffee experience look like? Obviously, you get specialty coffee, third, fourth, fifth wave, and all those things. And then you get coffees that are a bit more culturally relevant, like Turkish coffee. You go to Ethiopia and you get the Jebena. You go to Italy and you get a classic Italian espresso. South Africa doesn't really have that cultural part of coffee. To us, like the average coffee for the last 40 years has just been instant coffee. But with specialty coffee on the rise and specialty cafes popping up, and the idea of brewed coffee through espresso or filter in South Africa, it's starting to become a more common thing. But most of the cafes we see popping up are all based either very similar to what we see in the US or in Europe. And I've been asking myself, like, what does an authentic South African coffee experience look like? How can we see more of that? How can we see more originality when it comes to cafes in South Africa? I don't have the answer for it, but as far as what excites me and what interests me goes, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot more lately.
It's almost as if you want to be original and creative, you need to unplug from the steady stream of images and examples that are just pulling at your attention constantly, and you just fall in line where every single cafe looks the same and is an export in some adjacent way to what you were talking about, the European cafe and everything else. A lot of the culture that you're talking about with other countries and styles, maybe not as much, but it didn't have as much of a connectivity to something else. It had its own little environment where it was allowed to grow and become unique. You yourself are a testimony to that in your career when you have all this experience, but when you left all of the competition and everything else, you kind of found who you were as you left that environment. And maybe that's the next step for us as we focus on people and we disconnect from the steady stream of social media maybe a little bit more and focus on our local environments that we feel that need to be fast, like we need answers really quick. So maybe we should sit longer with the idea of what my bar should be rather than saying, well, today I'm going to figure out exactly what my bar should be. Just in this next 12 hours. Stew on that a little bit and allow yourself to develop longer than the split second that you think you need to figure everything out. We do have some time to do this. So I like where you're going with that. Winston, obviously, like you said, there's a lot more we can talk about, and another podcast for another day. It'd be great to have you back on the show sometime in the future to talk more about, coffee and the industry. But this has been really fantastic. So thank you so much for being on the show and all of the wise words that you've shared with us. I think this has really been impactful. How can we stay in touch with you and what you do through your consulting and training and Cedar Coffee?
Thanks, Chris. It's a big honor to be on the show. Thank you for taking the time and for having me and for considering me for the show as well. You can find me on Instagram at Cedar Coffee Roasters. And then my personal Instagram is Winston_Douglas, which is my second name and not my surname. Yeah, you can find me online. You can send us an email at Cedar. We'd love to work with cafes in the US where multi-roaster cafes are a thing. I think it would be quite interesting to have an African coffee roaster on bar. And so just info at Cedar Coffee Roasters, as simple as that.
Well, thank you again, Winston. Wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, everyone. Well, I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope that you did as well. It is saying a lot that no matter where you end up in specialty coffee, you can reach great heights, as Winston has, and yet come back to the simple truths about caring for people, letting them know that you are there to serve them in simplicity and without making them feel bad for where they are on their journey, to really dive into a relationship first and then allow the relevant information to come out. So he's talking about maybe conversations he's having with prospective clients for Cedar Coffee or just people that you're serving in the cafe on a daily basis. It takes a lot of maturity, I think, and Winston has gone through these phases of his career to not make it a known fact about accolades and everything else, because we know that those things oftentimes are for our own development. And maybe we can use them for marketing here and there, but I love the perspective of making sure that we are providing a service that resonates with people where they are, not where we have been. I think that's a huge point that I take away from this conversation with Winston, somebody who's obviously very well decorated, well traveled in coffee, and yet operates with a humility that makes his businesses and his words ring true and is very attractive to potential clients and peers in the industry alike. So I hope that you found that inspirational and took away a lot yourself. A huge thank you to Winston for being on our show. It is such an honor. And if you are interested in learning more about what Winston does, go ahead and visit Cedar Coffee Roasters on Instagram. That's just at Cedar Coffee Roasters. And you can find Winston on Instagram over at Winston_Douglas. And also you can check out the Instagram handle Winston Douglas Coffee, which is the consulting and training company that Winston also runs at winstonduglascoffee.com. So a huge thank you again. We really appreciate you being on the show, Winston. Now, if any of you have questions or comments or feedback about episodes like this one or any on the show, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. And don't forget, that's also where you can reach out for Keys to the Shop consulting. We can have a conversation about working together and also being a part of the key holder coaching groups, the second iteration coming up in March. That will be something that I think you'll want to be plugged into. It's for coffee shop owners and operators, current coffee shop owners and operators that want to have a peer-to-peer accountability, inspiration, encouragement group to be a part of. It's very powerful, and I think it would be very beneficial. So email chris@keystotheshop.com if you're interested in that. And so now we come to the end of the show. I appreciate all of you taking the time to be supporters of Keys to the Shop. The best way to support the show, on top of listening to the show, is to share these episodes with other people. If you also want to rate or review the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give a 5-star rating and review. Goes a long way. I will be eternally grateful. And spread the word at Keys to the Shop is a resource that people can look to help them develop their businesses, develop their careers, and their perspectives in coffee. So many people still don't know about the show, and you are key. See what I did there? You are key to having the word spread. And I really appreciate that. So share the episodes, subscribe to the show, and thank you so much, everybody. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.